Hello, I won't tell you who I am, because it doesn't matter. I'm just the voice between what you see and what you were never meant to know. My only purpose here is simple: to give you pieces, fragments of what's been buried. Not to convince you, not to prove anything, but to place a question in your mind that never quite goes away. If one day these videos stop, if the channel goes dark without warning, don't go looking for an explanation. Just know, silence is not always voluntary. Until then, you listen, I'll talk, and together we'll open the next file. Let me ask you a simple question. Why does every single U.S. state have at least one abandoned Air Force base? Not a handful, not a dozen, all 50. From the frost-bitten corners of Alaska to the silent flatlands of Nebraska, from the swamps of Florida to the canyons of Arizona, each one has a ghost, a concrete scar, a site that once buzzed with military precision and now just sits, quiet, fenced, monitored. And the silence? It's not neglect, it's deliberate. You can find them if you look hard enough. A forgotten airstrip in the desert, a crumbling control tower behind a locked gate, a faded U.S. Air Force sign half swallowed by vines. Local maps won't mark them, state officials won't talk about them. And yet they remain, outliving administrations, wars, and even memory itself. Let's make this clear. These are not ruins. They're not overgrown airfields waiting for investors. They're not historical landmarks. They are active in their own absence. Because here's the truth, buried under decades of denial. More than 120 Air Force installations have been deactivated since World War II, and almost none have been destroyed. They're not sold. They're not open to the public. Most haven't even been reclassified. Instead, they fall into a strange category. Retained, but inactive. That's not a closure. That's a pause button, with no date to press play and no plan to erase. And that raises a terrifying possibility. Maybe they're not abandoned at all. Take a moment. Zoom out. Imagine the U.S. as a grid. Now plot every one of these abandoned sites. What you'll see isn't random. It's a network, scattered evenly across the nation, like nodes in a forgotten system. A base in Oregon, another in Alabama, one more in upstate New York, some connected by highways, others sitting miles from the nearest town. And yet, when researchers try to track down ownership, they hit a wall. These facilities aren't listed under the Department of Defense. They're registered to shell corporations with names like Echo Property Group or Stellar Land Services. No websites, no CEOs, just empty addresses, often in Delaware, always in the shadows. Why go through the trouble to hide what no longer matters? Because maybe it does matter. Maybe it never stopped. Let's look at what's been observed. In Montana, drone hobbyists flying near an old radar base noticed motion-activated lights clicking on around midnight. In Nevada, a group of explorers caught heat signatures inside a supposedly dormant operations building in the middle of winter. In Oklahoma, a decommissioned runway had fresh tire tracks. Not civilian, not reported. None of these locations had functioning public access. No listed tenants. But the power is on, and so is something else. Coincidence? And then there's the enforcement. Not military, not police. Private security with no badges, no name tags, and no facial expressions. Uniforms without logos. SUVs without plates. They appear when you get too close. They don't ask questions. They don't make threats. They just say one sentence. You're not supposed to be here. And you believe them. Here's the deeper question no one's willing to ask. Why preserve so many dormant military sites quietly for decades? Why fund maintenance crews? Why upgrade fencing? Why run fiber optic cables to a place that's out of use? Because these aren't relics. They're reserve assets. Some believe they're part of a shadow infrastructure, a classified fallback grid that can be activated instantly in times of national crisis. Imagine it. The power grid collapses, the internet vanishes, communications shut down. Where do you reroute command? Not the White House, not the Pentagon. You go underground. You go to the bases no one remembers. Others believe these sites are containment zones, not for people, but for technologies, experiments, programs that were too unstable to declassify. One FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, request uncovered a reference to residual defense sites with embedded experimental payloads. What does that mean? No one knows, because the response to the request was one line: this record cannot be processed for national security reasons. No denial, no explanation, just no. There's one base in Colorado listed as closed since 1975, but if you call local land offices about it, they transfer you to the Department of the Interior, then to Homeland Security, then to no one, and then nothing. It's as if the building exists in paper purgatory, invisible, untouchable, but never gone. So here's the question we're left with. If these bases are dead, why are they breathing? Because they are. You can feel it when you're near one. You can hear it in the silence that's too perfect. You can sense it in the way the air seems guarded. And if they're not for us, then who or what are they really for? If every state in America has one of these abandoned bases, and if none of them are truly left behind, then we have to ask what exactly used to happen inside them. Not the official story, not the sanitized history you'd read in a training manual or government press release. I mean what really happened, behind the sealed hangars, beneath the runways, inside the parts of these bases that no one talks about. There are whispers, old documents, half-scrubbed memos, testimony from people who disappear after one interview, stories of psychological experiments, chemical testing, classified technology, and people who were never meant to be seen. In a 1978 internal memo from a now decommissioned base in New Mexico, there's mention of emergent cognitive response under sustained sensory modulation. Translation: subjects were placed in isolation chambers where sound, light, and spatial orientation were manipulated to the brink of psychosis, not to break them, but to map exactly when and how the mind bends. The project was called Crowline. It was marked obsolete, but no termination date was listed. In Tennessee, there's a site referred to by locals as the field that breathes. It's officially closed, fenced off, and unlisted in state property records. But residents report fog rolling in only over that land, and electronics that glitch when passing nearby. A woman once claimed her grandfather worked there and refused to talk about it. When he died, every light bulb in the house burst at the same time. One former staffer called it a containment zone, but never said what it was containing. Some bases had sublevels, multi-tiered underground vaults with no logical purpose, schematics that dead-end into reinforced walls, construction contracts that mention environmental control modules without defining the environment being controlled. An architect who worked on an Illinois facility in the 60s described a sealed chamber labeled non-reactive storage. When pressed, he answered simply, things we couldn't destroy, but couldn't leave above ground either. 3 months later, he was killed in a one-car collision. Case closed. Others mention low-frequency testing, auditory manipulation programs designed to alter behavior using sound waves below the level of conscious perception. A project named Static Mirror appears briefly in a redacted Air Force briefing. Its stated goal: emotional modulation in confined populations via pulsed acoustic intervals. The memo ends with a single line in bold: "Do not replicate without Level 5 clearance." No further explanation. There's also the aerosol testing. During the 1970s, several bases, now labeled inactive, were identified in DoD records as dispersal evaluation fields for chemical agents. Some of these substances were never named, only marked atmospheric influence variables. At least 2 environmental reports from the EPA flagged contamination near former test sites, but both investigations were halted due to what was described as federal jurisdictional obstruction. Not denied, just redirected. And then there's the personnel, or rather, the missing ones. For many of these locations, complete staff records don't exist. Assignment logs are incomplete. In some cases, entire months are unaccounted for in operational files. A few veterans who claim to have served on these sites find that their records have been scrubbed or replaced with standard discharge papers, missing dates or duties. One technician reported being transferred mid-shift from one base to another with no briefing and no return order. Another spoke of aircraft landing without ID codes, pilots who never spoke, and uniforms with no insignia. He said, "They weren't ours," but no one questioned them. And those are just the stories that made it out. How many didn't? How many whistleblowers were silenced before the first word left their mouths? How many programs vanished not because they ended, but because they became something else? Look past the official terms: weather station, communications training site, defense logistics satellite compound. They sound harmless, but if you've seen the photos, those sealed corridors, the reinforced doors, the complete absence of human activity, you'll know something's off. These were not just places of operation. They were places of containment, manipulation, and experimentation. They were designed for things the public would never be allowed to understand, and perhaps that's the real reason they were never repurposed. Because to do so, you'd have to walk back in. You'd have to open doors that were meant to stay closed. You'd have to admit what was done, and risk revealing that whatever they were testing might still be active. So what once happened inside these bases? Maybe the better question is, how much of it ever really stopped? In theory, military infrastructure has a clear life cycle. A base opens, it serves, then it's decommissioned, demolished, sold, repurposed. That's how things are supposed to work. Yet somehow, across 50 states, over 100 Air Force sites have escaped that process entirely. Not closed, not cleared, just paused, frozen in time. Government documents describe these bases as retired assets, and yet no standard demolition contracts exist, no public land transfers, no redevelopment plans. Instead, many of these sites linger in legal limbo, technically inactive, practically untouched. Some officials say it's too expensive to demolish them. But that claim collapses when you consider that multiple demolition proposals were drafted and approved, then suddenly canceled. One base in Iowa was scheduled for teardown in 2006. The contractor was selected, equipment delivered, and within a week, the entire project was postponed indefinitely. The company involved was quietly bought out by a shell firm, their files sealed. Why stop a demolition at the last minute? Why let reinforced structures, communications towers, and hardened shelters sit idle for decades if they truly serve no purpose? Because they do serve a purpose. just not a public one. Satellite imagery shows signs of ongoing upkeep, fresh fencing, cleanly cut perimeters, debris removed after storms. Some sites have had their electrical grids replaced. Others now show fiber optic lines leading to underground nodes, despite having no listed activity. In Utah, one dormant base upgraded its storm drainage in 2022. Not the kind of maintenance you invest in for ruins. The budget trail, if you follow it far enough, is even stranger. Many of these inactive facilities are associated with annual maintenance contracts tucked under vague labels like structural preparedness or contingency infrastructure. They don't appear in defense budget summaries. They're buried deep within civilian agency allocations, contracted out to private firms whose names shift year to year. In 2015, a journalist tried to trace one such contract attached to a base in New Mexico. The company's office was a rented mailbox. The CEO's name didn't appear in any public database. The trail led nowhere. Within a month, the journalist's article was pulled offline. The publisher cited editorial misalignment. Who pays for these ghost sites? Who maintains them? And perhaps more importantly, why is no one allowed to ask? Zoning records offer another clue. In several counties, developers applying for permits near former bases were denied, not by local planning boards, but by obscure federal committees not listed on any regional jurisdiction map. One legal advisor received a letter stating, per Section 4(b) of the Federal Domestic Contingency Clause, this land remains under protection. No explanation. No appeal. And then there's the insurance. Multiple sites, despite being unoccupied for years, are still insured by firms based offshore. A disused runway in Arizona carries a policy valued at $18 million. No air traffic, no active base, but a premium that suggests otherwise. All this points to one conclusion. These bases were never truly deactivated. They were hidden behind paperwork, behind restructuring, behind silence. Not because they failed, but because they still hold value. Not for missions we know about, but for contingencies no one is willing to describe. One theory is fallback infrastructure. In the event of mass cyber attack, EMP strikes, or full-spectrum communication loss, these bases would reactivate, providing hardened, analog-ready command hubs immune to modern systems collapse. That might explain the updated power lines, new ventilation systems, and equipment shielding observed at multiple locations. They weren't abandoned, they were preserved. Another theory is more delicate. These sites serve as containers, not for weapons or people, but for programs. Projects that cannot exist on the books, research that can't be legally conducted in public spaces, experiments that live in the gray area between defense and denial. Facilities like these would offer exactly what such work demands: isolation, silence, and plausible deniability. And that's the key word, plausible. Because if the public believes a place is useless, you can do almost anything behind its gates, without scrutiny, without oversight, and without ever needing to justify your presence. In 2010, a former base logistics officer, retired and living overseas, was asked why so many inactive sites still had working infrastructure. He paused and said, "If a place was built to disappear, you'd be surprised how well it stays useful." He died less than a year later. Heart failure, no autopsy filed. These sites remain not because they've been forgotten, but because they've been designated invisible, unspoken, unclaimed, but always accounted for, just in places no one thinks to look. They weren't closed. They were folded away. Maps lie, not because they intend to, but because they can only show what we're allowed to see. Borders, roads, airports, bases, but not all bases, not the ones that were built to vanish, or worse, to be ignored. And if you overlay those forgotten dots, those abandoned Air Force sites, across the continental United States, a new kind of map begins to form. These bases aren't randomly scattered. They're strategically placed, forming a grid beneath the visible world. Connect them, and you'll find corridors of silence, empty routes through dense territory, equidistant nodes as if someone once designed a system beneath the surface. Some align eerily with fiber optic trunk lines. Others fall in sync with decommissioned missile silos, or beneath stretches of highway that were inexplicably overbuilt. The pattern resembles an operating system, one running quietly beneath the one we think we live in. A separate network, a hidden layer of infrastructure. And once you see it, you start asking, which America is really in charge? The one above ground that we can vote on, or the one buried, compartmentalized, and silently funded year after year? Let's go further. Some of these bases are located within striking proximity to academic research hubs, MIT, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, Oak Ridge. Facilities with known partnerships in defense, surveillance, and AI development. If a discovery is made that cannot be risked in the public sphere, where would it go? Where can you isolate data, personnel, ethics? You'd need a place invisible to the system, yet built into it. You'd need a base that no longer exists, but still stands. In the Midwest, there's a site that sits less than 3 miles from a private biotech campus. The area has no population, no commercial traffic, and yet local emergency protocols included in hazardous material evacuation routes. No one admits why. The official explanation? In case of federal disruption. What kind of disruption, no one will say. In the Southwest, a contractor delivering hardware to what he believed was an agricultural storage depot was rerouted at the last minute. He was told the coordinates were wrong. His new route led him through 3 unmarked checkpoints. His cargo? High-efficiency water cooling systems, intended, he thought, for desert irrigation. But the base he delivered to had no crops, just ventilation shafts. And then there are the connections no one wants to trace. During pandemic response planning, FEMA referenced alternate command hubs, unnamed, unmapped, and non-disclosable even to state officials. Journalists asked where they were. No answer. But the model used for interconnectivity, it matched nearly perfectly with the distribution of dormant Air Force bases. So what exactly are we looking at? We're looking at a second country layered under the first. Not a nation of people, but a nation of infrastructure. A system of backups, safe zones, testing grounds, and operational voids. Places not governed, but controlled. Places not run by presidents, but by protocol. The idea might sound paranoid, until you realize every major government operates with contingency doctrine. What happens if Washington, D.C. falls? What if airspace becomes compromised? What if the internet is fractured at the backbone? You don't wait for collapse. You prepare beneath it. These bases, once public, may now be pieces in a private game. Rented out, shared, rotated through government contractor alliances, so complex even Congress can't untangle the ownership. In this version of America, everything is modular, military, corporate, academic, each plugged into a machine that doesn't advertise itself but hums quietly in the dark. One former aerospace consultant called it the deep grid. If everything breaks, this is what boots back up first. The grid has no flag, no anthem, just cold utility and untraceable funding. And the scariest part? It's working, quietly, efficiently, unseen. You might have walked over one, drove past one, slept beside one, and never known, because if a nation wants to hide a nervous system, it doesn't bury it deep. It normalizes it. It calls it abandoned. It fences it off. It puts no name on the gate. And we believe it. Because we want to. Because the truth is heavier than fiction. And the fiction is easier to accept. This is Off Record. File 02. The map you know is only half the story. And the question is no longer, what are they hiding? It's this. If the ground beneath your feet was built for a different America, then which one do you actually live in? I am the anonymous voice they hope you ignore. I speak what they won't print. I ask the questions that don't get answered. If one day these files stop, you'll know they got too close. Follow Off Record before they make us silent.